Hello there, my name's Card. In my day-to-day life, I work as a historian, and here on my YouTube page, I like to make videos talking about all sorts of things that interest me. Today, I just wanted to very briefly articulate an opinion that's been on my mind for a little while now. When I had just started out working in the field of academic historical research, one of the first things I ended up having to do was go through a bunch of literary material related to the first few Crusades. In the course of doing this, I ended up spending a lot of time looking at biographies of all the principal commanding figures on all major sides. And there's still one thing in particular, now years later, that I took away from reading all this stuff that I can't seem to let go of. Saladin, the Ayyubid Sultan, who we remember today as essentially the de facto leader of the entire Muslim world during the Third Crusade, I can't help but think that no matter which way you look at him, he's vastly overrated. I say overrated, and not just bad, in large part because in both the Western world, and as far as I can tell, in the Muslim world, Saladin is, by far, the most well-known of any historic Muslim ruler, save perhaps for the Islamic prophet Muhammad himself. But when you think notable Muslim ruler, you think Saladin. And I think people just generally have a tendency to wrongly conflate being well known with being good at what someone's well known for, even when that's not the case. Ostensibly, Saladin was this upstart young warrior who ends up fighting his way to the top of his local warlord hierarchy, then claims leadership of the rest of the Muslim territories in Arabia and North Africa, and affirms his sultanhood by defeating the other claimants in battle just in time to become the face of the Islamic world opposite the European Crusader kings who show up to retake the Holy Land, which he soundly defeats, presumably Allah having willed it. The biggest problem I generally have with this simplified pop history version of Saladin's life is that it really understates how much his successes largely came down to either luck or happenstance, and more often than not, the actions of those around him. The first time I wrote out this script, I spent about 4,000 words going into the man's whole biography. But I decided to cut that and restart because I think it sort of misses the point. If you'd like to know more about the man's life story, a basic pop history book, or even just his Wikipedia article will basically suffice, really. All you need to know is that Saladin essentially is in the right spot to capitalize on some family connections early in his life, which he uses to take control of Egypt, which at the time had been long in decline, and was ripe for just about anyone to come along and grab the reins. And of course, not too long afterwards, the Third Crusade kicks off, and Saladin becomes one of the most prominent leaders on the Islamic side. And he wins his fair share of decisive battles in the conflict, and ultimately comes out of the Third Crusade better off than any of the factional interests on the Crusader side. By the end of his reign, Saladin has a track record that looks pretty good on paper. He had the loyalty of his subjects, and, by and large, the respect of his foes. You could argue that his sultanship was generally one of civic and military success. The thing is, for all the romanticization you want to do of the man's life, as medieval kings go, Saladin was very middle of the road, which, broadly speaking, was actually largely how he was remembered in the centuries immediately following his passing in the year 1193. Contemporary chroniclers acknowledged his successes in claiming the crown of Egypt and bringing the area back from its period of decline, and in driving the European forces of the Third Crusade out of the Holy Land. But they also even-handedly recorded that Saladin's Ayyubid dynasty didn't last that long after his death, nor did his victory in the Third Crusade permanently end foreign military incursion into the region. The Ayyubids had to cede a significant amount of their territory to local powers shortly after Saladin's death, none of the Sultan's immediate successors had the political strength to keep his empire together properly, and the whole dynasty was eventually ousted from Egypt and Syria a few generations later. Like a lot of nominally great leaders, you can pin a lot of Saladin's success on him just being in the right place at the right time to take up a position of authority and end up being the local power that overcomes all others. It's partially happenstance and partially just material conditions. And of course, survivorship bias. The same could be said for Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan, Napoleon, all people who found themselves leading a militarized society, were very successful in doing that for a while, but there is a tendency for societies of those sorts to pretty quickly fall apart shortly after their leader's defeat or death. Medieval Muslim historians noted this of Saladin. Whatever you want to make of his life's work and his rise to power, it didn't last that long after he was gone. Whether it was just because the moment the material conditions created for him had passed, or because Saladin's successors just lacked his personal leadership ability and couldn't run the dynasty properly, the result was the same. Even just as medieval sultans go, it's a pattern that repeats a lot if you read a few heavy histories of the Middle East. A lot of the region's military geopolitics were the outgrowth of tribal and familial territorial disputes. And what happened quite a bit was that some local warlord, somewhere in Arabia or North Africa, would dominate all of his local competition for a few years, establish himself as a serious regional power, but his dynasty typically wouldn't last more than 1 or 2 generations before either some other local power finally brought him down, or everyone else his group was suppressing properly coordinated their efforts to overthrow him. And the cycle just repeats and repeats for centuries. In the region I'm talking about today, the conflict was between emirs and viziers and sultans, but the same general pattern has been seen just about everywhere on Earth at one time or another. Saladin's rise wasn't that exceptional. Neither was his dynasty's downfall after his passing. So if that's what you're basing any particular reverence of the man on, I think you're missing the mark here. While I mention it too, putting aside his civic administrative career as the leader of a nation, I don't think Saladin's military victories, or his career as a martial leader, are anything particularly special either. Again, his time solidifying his rule militarily in North Africa just looks impressive because of survivorship bias and chance. Someone had to win those fights, so in hindsight, someone's military reputation was going to come out of it all looking good, and it just happened to end up being Saladin. Later on, against the Crusaders, it's a bit more of the same. Plus, Saladin mainly just avoids getting into any sort of battle unless he can win with massively advantageous numbers or positioning. Granted, that is militarily smart in its own sort of way, but Saladin was never the sort of general who could or would pull off upset victories against better opponents. Not that I want to indirectly do too much apologia for the Crusaders, but Saladin's victories over them weren't because he was a great battlefield commander. If anything, he was largely successful against the European forces, largely because of just how disorganized and fractious and logistically poor the Crusaders were by and large. Again, at the end of the day, Saladin was a fairly middling sultan and general, by any real metric you could try and measure these things by. He's just nothing special. But what I find almost more interesting about the man's legacy is why he's so relatively prominent in the Western pop history consciousness, even when I doubt the average person could name any other historic sultan. See, the idea of Saladin's legacy only started to really become a thing just before the 20th century. Prior to then, Saladin's name basically only appears as a footnote in Crusades history books. He's not a figure that people outside of some very niche medieval Islamic world historian circles will have ever heard of. He's not well known, and even among people who would recognize his name, he's not thought of as anything that special. Just one middle-of-the-road ruler in a long line of them. But one person essentially single-handedly turned Saladin into this almost household name overnight. And ever since, the past 120 years, his name's remained in the popular consciousness. That one person was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Wilhelm, growing up, had been something of a history nerd, and had taught himself about all the obscure kings and leaders to have come before him. In particular, he just happened to have a special interest in Asian and Middle Eastern rulers, to an extent you probably wouldn't have seen in anyone else in Europe at the time, outside of maybe a handful of Orientalist scholars. It just so happens that the Kaiser, in 1898, about 10 years into his reign, goes on this goodwill tour of the Ottoman Empire to try and improve relations between them and his Germany. While he's over there, he goes around to all the major museums and historical sites, because he's into that sort of thing. And while he's wandering around Damascus's historical district one day, he happens upon Saladin's tomb. And at the time, this tomb is basically just a tiny sandstone room with a faded nameplate on the door. It's rarely visited, no one takes care of it, there's plants growing up through the floor, and there's garbage piling up outside. And Kaiser Wilhelm is shocked at seeing this. Wilhelm had grown up reading about all the medieval sultans, and I suspect he had started to idolize or romanticize them to himself in some way, because he can't square the fact that all these mighty exotic warrior kings he's read so much about are just nowadays being left to moulder somewhere in a back alley. It might be perfectly accurate to say that in 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm was the world's biggest medieval sultan fanboy, and Saladin was his absolute favourite historical figure. But seeing this run-down old tomb, where the man's bones have just been laying around for 700 years, hammers home the fact that nobody else cares about him the way Wilhelm does, and no one has for centuries by this point. Not to get too armchair psychologist about the whole thing, but I think Wilhelm had a sort of existential crisis after seeing Saladin's rundown tomb. The Kaiser, King of Germany, can see something of himself in this figure from the past he's read so much about. Wilhelm isn't hugely popular back at home, and he's really anxious about Germany's position and image among the other European countries, and he's immensely concerned with how he personally will be remembered by history. So, Kaiser Wilhelm decides to personally bankroll the construction of a whole new, really luxurious mausoleum to reinter Saladin's body in, because he gets it in his head that even a leader he idolizes, like the great Sultan Saladin, can just end up getting left forgotten somewhere. So he should try and bring back the idea of treating dead royalty lavishly and put that idea back in the public mind. When Wilhelm goes back to Europe after his tour's done, he starts showing off his hand-drawn design proposals for the new Saladin mausoleum to the aristocratic guests at state dinner parties and diplomatic functions, as if to say, this is really how we should be treating dead kings. The Kaiser's weird turn-of-the-century obsession with building a fancy memorial to his favourite medieval ruler is what single-handedly brings Saladin into the popular consciousness in the West. Prior to that, he had virtually zero name recognition basically anywhere. But Wilhelm II more or less arbitrarily picked up a medieval sultan and decided to hype him specifically up as a great king. There is no one alive today who was around when the Kaiser visited that tomb and got all obsessed with renewing it. Yet, if you go to Damascus today, you can still see the fancy mausoleum he built and Saladin's new resting place in it. Even more remarkably, the quasi-mythic view of Saladin as the greatest Muslim ruler that the Kaiser fostered still persists. In pop culture, whether it's books, television shows, movies, games, Saladin is still considered the go-to choice if you want to tell a story about a historical Muslim leader. Weirder still, all that pop culture reverence was just the early passion project of the guy who would later go on to start, then lose, the First World War. I think the closest comparison you could make would be to Alexander Hamilton, the first US Treasury Secretary. 10 years ago, really only die-hard American Revolutionary-era history nerds could have told you who he was. Otherwise, he's just some guy who died 200 years ago, who you might have vaguely heard of if you were paying attention in school. But now, all of a sudden, there's a big musical about him, and everyone knows his name again for the first time in centuries. That's what Kaiser Wilhelm did for Saladin. He picked up his favorite historical guy, made him famous again, and for some reason, it stuck more than 120 years. It's just something I wanted to think aloud on for a bit. I think it's really interesting how these historical figures we might assume to have been in the popular consciousness forever are sometimes just artificially made famous long after their own lives, and we might unduly ascribe historical weight to people and what they did based more on name recognition than anything else. Saladin is the perfect example of someone whose historical impact or importance is far too overstated, and who therefore is too highly regarded by people who have become aware of him through his large presence in pop history. Anyway, it's just a thought I've been holding on to for a while now, but I would be interested to hear from anyone who might have a different take on the matter. Thank you for listening, and if you might want to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page, or take a look at my other videos. Either way, goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.